When are overdoses more likely to occur, and how can we use this information to help people? So, there are specific times of day, events, and even weather changes that make people more likely to overdose. And some of them are dependent on the drug that people are taking. So, here's the important information that you need to know to look out for signs of things like overdoses. So let me start with the most dangerous time for overdoses, and that is during periods of transition. So what I mean by that is like when people are getting out of jail or prison and trying to do successful reentry, as well as when people get out of rehab. And here is why it is so dangerous. It is so dangerous first and foremost due to tolerance. Here's the thing, when you're in jail or prison or rehab, you're typically detoxing. So you stop using the drug during that period of time. And then if you get out and start to use again, which is very common, relapse is very common, it is incredibly hard to quit drugs. If you go back and start using again, yeah, your tolerance is back to what it was when you first started using it. A lot of people don't take that into account. Now, for some drugs, this isn't that big of a deal because the dose that people commonly take is relatively far away from the dose that can cause you to overdose. But for things like opioids and alcohol, the dose that causes an effect is very close to the dose that can potentially kill you. So for things like alcohol and for a lot of opioids, even things like H, we're talking about like 10 to 1. That's always a ratio. So let me talk through a little bit of what could occur after somebody gets out of rehab. So let's say that somebody before rehab starts using at like 1 milligram of an opioid. I am not talking about actual doses here. I'm just talking about hypothetical doses, but let's say they use 1 milligram. And then they just keep using. And eventually, over time, they might have to work their way up to 10 milligrams to feel the same effects. That's tolerance. So when they get back out, they were previously using 10 milligrams. And if they went back to that dose, yeah, you see the problem here. So 10 to 1 therapeutic index. So if 1 milligram is enough to get them high, 10 milligrams can potentially kill them. Now, would it have killed them before? No, it would have just gotten them high. But now that they don't have the tolerance, it can kill them. And so we see that the likelihood of overdoses substantially increases, especially in the first 2 weeks after returning from jail or rehab. And not only is tolerance a problem there, but think about what it is like to relapse after you get out of jail or after you get out of rehab. So there's a stigma against this. There's a huge stigma against drug use. So if somebody quits, goes to rehab, let's say 90 days and comes back out, they're probably not going to tell people that they are using again. And so not only are they potentially at higher risk just because of the tolerance aspects, they are also more likely to use alone. And if you use alone, you are also more likely to die from overdose. And yeah, those transitions are extremely stressful. So if you just get out of jail or prison, yeah, you typically don't have your world set up for you. In a lot of cases, it's going to be incredibly hard to find a good living situation, to find a good job, to actually be set up to succeed. And so you're going to experience that increase in stress. And yeah, stress is a trigger for further drug use. We also see that time of day may actually matter here too. Now, time of day does not seem to matter as much for just general drug use. People use drugs pretty much throughout the entire day. But that's not necessarily true for fatal overdoses. So what we see is that those are more likely to occur, and just more severe overdoses in general are more likely to occur at night. So at night, people are actually more likely to co-use drugs. So have a drink with the drug of their choice. And that makes somebody more likely to overdose. And then you just have access to fewer resources at night. You know that you can't go into a doctor. You know that the emergency room is going to be wild. You know that you're going to be asking people to bring you in late at night. And that typically leads to more severe outcomes. Now, there's another weird thing that is linked to an increase of fatal overdoses, and that is temperature. Now, this one is dependent on the drug that you're actually taking. So it seems like opioid and alcohol overdoses are more likely to occur during kind of winter months. And this is due to the mechanism of action of the drugs. So what we see is that things like alcohol and opioids, they typically kill you by respiratory depression. So basically they slow down your breathing until it stops, and then you eventually die from that. Now, we also see that the cold increases respiratory depression. So it makes it more likely that that fatal symptom of the drug is likely to occur. So we're just more likely to see respiratory depression and thus death during colder months with things like alcohol and opioids. Now, this is reversed for things like MDMA. So for something like ecstasy, what you'll commonly see is that an increase in temperature is potentially more disastrous for somebody to overdose on things like MDMA. Now, this seems to be linked to physical activity plus hot weather. So maybe not just hot weather alone, but I can go off about that forever. Let me know if you want a video on it. But here's the thing, not only do you have the main effects of drugs, so what we see is respiratory depression is increased with cold, and that's increased with alcohol and opioids too, and hyperthermia is increased with MDMA, and you'd see an increase in that in hot weather. Not only do you see those kind of direct links, but there's kind of indirect links between weather and overdoses too. So, for example, opioids and alcohol just make you think that you're not as cold as you actually are. And this can lead to hypothermia. So, this was actually one of the big warnings that we had in college because I went to college in Minnesota and Minnesota is cold. So, there are far too many deaths of like college students who just go out, fall asleep in the cold and the snow because they don't feel cold and then never wake up in the morning. Then you have the problem with the more you stigmatize drug use, the less likely somebody is to tell you that they're actually doing it, and the more likely they are to then be alone and increases likelihood of overdosing. So, like, we should be warning people about these things. We should be specifically warning people when they get out of rehab or jail or prison that they need to be aware that their tolerance is not what it used to be. We need to make people aware of like when this is likely to happen too. Not just like time of day, but how soon after they take the drug. So a lot of people think that overdoses are like immediate. And I talk about this a lot when I talk about drugs. So I'll talk about like the peak effects, and people are like, the peak effects are not 1 to 3 minutes after the drug. And I'm like, yeah, the peak effects are, but the immediate effects are immediate. So peak effects are different. Peak effects are like when the drug is fully in your system and when you're feeling the effects. And so in some cases, things like opioid overdoses, they can occur like 1 to 3 hours after somebody has taken the drug. And like during that period of time, there is time for intervention. So for things like Narcan, which by the way work extremely well, you see effects within a few minutes, and you don't typically see a rebound effect. So once you give Narcan, you are good at giving Narcan. Now sometimes you might have to do multiple doses. Like Narcan is not going to do anything problematic for somebody who is not overdosing on an opioid. So just when in doubt, go ahead and try to help somebody. Be prepared. Find out a little bit more about the drugs that you or other people you know are taking so you can recognize these symptoms of overdose. Come prepared with things like Narcan. My local library gives out a little packet that has Narcan in it. So if you or somebody you know uses, keep one with you. And let's reduce the stigma. So about 65 to 96% of people who use drugs have seen somebody overdose. That's a lot of people who need to know this information so they can know what they're looking for. And the more we reduce stigma, the more we are literally saving lives here.